Okay, this is the only non-game specific chapter. It's an introductory chapter. It's called It's Exciting to Recognize a Revolution in Progress. Holy cow, that's verbose for a chapter title. It's not exaggerative though. I remember the first ripples, at least as they filtered through living rooms. Over the following decade, the persistently new, steadily groundbreaking game world would remain exciting and unpredictable. There was so much to take in. It seemed that as soon as my blown mind would recover from the last innovation, it would be reblown by a succeeding one. The first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey, reached the end of the assembly line on the same day that I did, in January of '72, so video games and I grew up together, and it was spectacular to watch them evolve. My favorite era begins in the mid-'70s and ends around the time when the decidedly unreal, imagination-fueling game was replaced with the real-time interactive movie for all intents and purposes. The latter hands everything to the player, removing his brain from the scenario's formation. And I'll interject here, I'll add that I consider games from that early, glorious 20 or 25 year period to represent an entirely different kind of interactive electronic entertainment from any game that came out during the 21st century, say, or the late 90s through today. Old games are often compared to new ones, and that's a non sequitur. The comparison shouldn't be made and really cannot. Each game during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s is its own self-contained world. You really don't even want to compare two games that both came out in 1980 or 82 or whatever, because graphically and otherwise, each game is its own world and has its own paradigm. The characters look like that in that game. There's no comparing them to reality. I'm not looking for realism in a video game. And later games do amount to interactive movies. It's not that I don't like any of them. Well, the most modern console I own is a PlayStation 2. But if we're talking about graphics, the resourcefulness and brilliance that went into those older so-called blocky graphics are immense. They're great skills. And I really dig the abstract graphics. You know, before digitization and attempts at realism. I get into this a bit later, but I dig a video game that knows it's a video game, you know? And I don't like it when somebody says, well, this is a good game for that console. It's like you've chosen to play that game. That's the world you're in. Go with the gameplay. Is it fun? Does it feel good to play? Anyway, back to the book. This is not a wholesale denunciation of modern games. I simply don't usually find them to be as much fun, by and large, because the make-believe is gone. Well, along with the creative risk-taking. Now, by the time I was in kindergarten, in 1976 or 77, my folks owned a yellow game system that was liberated from the hall closet on the odd weekend night. It played Pong, but my dad referred to it as hockey, so that must have been one of the variations on it. It was actually the Magnavox Odyssey 300. It was easy to identify online years later, as it was the company's only console that was colored like a bumblebee. And once my father had undertaken the mysterious process of hooking it up, an event took place. I found it extremely bizarre and nifty that I could move something around that was on television. We kept the unit when we moved the following year, and I attended the first grade, but I don't remember seeing it after that. Either it had been thrown away as an exhausted novelty before we moved again to Albuquerque in '79, or it remained somewhere in the new house for a few months and we had lost interest. Admittedly, the neatness had tended to give way to monotony after an hour or two of playing. You know, kids and their lack of patience. In '81, my father dragged me and my younger brother to wait in the lobby of a fitness center while he exercised. The place might have been called the Atlas Gym, as a man-holding planet figure stood in one corner, and upon arriving, Mike and I saw a strange coffee table between the reception couches, and walked over to investigate as Dad went off to torture himself by deliberately lifting heavy things over and over again. It was a so-called cocktail model, I call them coffee table models, of the Asteroids Deluxe coin-op. This was the first arcade video game that I had ever encountered. The lines and square ball of Pong had evolved into floating boulders and a spaceship. I was astonished. You could actually fire at things. If you managed to pulverize them all, a new cluster materialized that was more difficult to contend with. This was a story of sorts, rather than a predictable ping-pong affair. I ran after Dad and asked if he had any quarters. For an exasperatingly brief time, Mike and I took turns playing. I remember that it became a whole new game when I worked up the nerve to see what the thrust button did. A flying saucer occasionally appeared for a fleeting duel, but it wasn't interested enough in my demise to stop during its flight across the screen. There was also some kind of satellite that broke into segments when I blasted it, kind of an evil pie chart, and the slices individually attacked my ship. New elements like that had never arisen on our old console. To me, this was the very height of technology. Now, I've used the phrase "my ship" purposefully, as I also recall the enormity of that very thought. As long as I could keep it in one piece, it was mine. My first ship. Hey, how many remote-controlled, genuinely destructive spacecraft does a kid get to command, right? Each of the 3 that I received appeared to function on its own, devoid of physical nudging, and yet I covertly controlled its every move. I was entirely responsible for its continued existence. Nobody was going to help me. This was thrilling to a 9-year-old. We quickly used up the quarters. We could then only watch the demonstration mode that had beguiled us to begin with. I desired so much to take over the spaceship again that I summoned the gall to approach one of the gym's members, a stranger who had just arrived, and ask if I could borrow a quarter. The man walked over and looked at the game. "Yeah, you'd better show me how to play," he said, and got us a couple dollars worth from the woman behind the counter. Remember when strangers did cool things like that sometimes? Well, for that matter, remember when it wasn't a big deal to leave your kids unattended? When Dad did come back out to check on us, the stranger winked and told him, "They're showing me how to play." With some embarrassment, he thanked the guy and returned to his workout. Our benefactor followed him shortly thereafter, having realized that he could easily extricate himself without being rude. We were still showing ourselves how to play, after all. Over the next few years, playing any arcade game was a huge occasion. This aspect seems to be nearly forgotten among the extensive prose and videos and podcasts that fill today's various media. Part of the excitement was the intimidation that radiated from this dark, daunting portal between the familiar world and an often literally alien one. You didn't want to make any mistakes, because the end of your visit was brought closer by each, and additional quarters would rarely be supplied, right? You hungered for enough skills to gain access to as much of that enticing other world as possible, to earn the spatial freedom to explore it, and perhaps even subjugate it. One night in late 81 or early 82, my father decided to bring me to the bar with him. I can't remember the circumstances. Maybe my mom had taken my brother elsewhere. Now, Dad seldom drank, but when we got there, I beheld the real object of his patronage, Pac-Man. The striking cabinet stood in the entrance area. I'm quite sure that even back then he wouldn't have been permitted to stroll into the actual bar with me. This was many years ago, so my memory could be atypically misleading. It might just have been a non-kid-oriented restaurant of some kind. He dropped a quarter in, pushed the button, and explained what he was doing as he steered the featureless yellow head around the radiant blue maze. I'd never seen the game. I was captivated. I didn't have a clue what a pack was, spelled that way, but this was surely the most incredible scientific progression from the single-colored Asteroids Deluxe that was possible. I didn't even know that these things were called video games. There were Asteroids Deluxe machines and now Pac-Man machines. They made pinball tables seem blandly realistic and chance-based by comparison. I played next, and found my focus distracted by the wild colors and multi-character behavior, with each adversary behaving slightly differently from the others, something that was not taken for granted yet. I cleared little more than a couple of corridors worth of dots. I don't think I even managed to reach one of the energizers before all 3 Pac-Men had peeled themselves into nothing like suicidal bananas. "It takes practice," I heard over my shoulder in that state-the-obvious manner of dads. Now he brought home an Atari video computer system in February of '82. For the most part, this sort of thing only happened when it was birthday or Christmas time, which it currently wasn't. He had also bought the Space Invaders cartridge, so he must have been playing the coin-op somewhere. Looking back, I feel lucky that he's always been curious about new technology. In fact, his interest has surpassed mine since then, at least in terms of modernity. He doesn't play video games anymore, but he's confounded by my unwillingness to get a cellular phone. The minor role reversal is comical. Now, for some reason, I had hardly been aware of the Atari VCS, later renamed the 2600, of course, based on its model number. I seldom watched television even back then, so I must have figured this enigmatic Atari thing that I'd heard about at school for yet another Pong clone. The occasional classmate would announce, "We got an Atari," in a tone of voice suggesting that his parents had decided to trade the family car for an airplane. We didn't have the Sears version. It was an early Atari 4-switcher, with combat packed in. Notice I say packed in, or we could just say the console came with combat. In the 80s and at least most of the 90s, nobody used the term bundled. That was a phone company's marketing term. You were supposed to integrate that into your language. Bundled is meant to give the idea that spending exorbitantly on something you don't really need is somehow comfy. Anyway, I inspected the console's box after Dad had removed its contents, and it began to dawn on me. Those extraordinary games, for which I never had sufficient quarters, could somehow be played on a television. As trite as it sounds, this was utterly too good to be true. VCS games turned out to be much more intriguing indeed than so-called hockey, of course. They were too good. I couldn't, quote, play Atari enough. That was all I did when allowed. I also coveted games that I hadn't played yet. I didn't care which ones they were. I just wanted to see what they were like. They all looked exciting. I didn't stop running around outdoors, riding my bike, or trying to improve on the piano and the guitar, but otherwise I invariably pretended that I was inside some kind of video game setting. I obsessed over the screenshots in the green-covered Atari game catalog that had come with the console, as well as Tom Hirschfeld's book, How to Master the Video Games. I had ordered that from, the Scholastic book order form at school, or Weekly Reader or something. And if memory serves, it had taken precisely 60 years to arrive. I've always gotten a kick out of that title, How to Master the Video Games. One set of games had been made, and that was going to be it. There you go, now get lost. I even invented my own games that I fantasized about programming someday. I must have read somewhere, maybe in Electronic Games magazine, that all these games were created by guys called programmers. In notebooks and drawing tablets, and on my Trapper Keeper, and the wooden slats supporting the upper bunk, I drew the graphics of games that I could play by moving the tip of my finger around. And during our summertime '82 visit back east to see relatives, I learned how to program in BASIC, the era's common entry-level computer language, by reading a book that I had borrowed from the library near my grandmother's house. Decades after the fact, I found it used online. It's called It's Basic. And I started writing out my own BASIC programs almost immediately. Most of them were, choose-your-own-adventure type games. The instructional book wasn't computer-specific, so it didn't extend to graphics or sound or anything. All that I really knew how to work with for the moment was text. After returning home, I continued to fill college-ruled pages with code, but I wouldn't be able to try out any of my ideas until January of '84, when dependable Dad bought me a Commodore 64 for my 12th birthday. And I've been playing the old games ever since. In the mid-90s, I began to notice unfamiliar adjectives, such as classic and vintage. I thought, oh, they're classic now, are they? Well, if you say so, they don't feel aged to me, as I associate them with recent playing, having never really stopped. I've only added. New old favorites, so to speak, are discovered all the time, right? Especially thanks to emulators. So nostalgia plays a very, very minor part for me. Not that I won't be telling brief stories about 80s experiences while opining on the upcoming games, but I dig them in present terms as well, which is handy as the present is all that ever exists. As a transition into the game chapters, I'll briefly explain how I've approached them. Here, in other words, is the preliminary material that did not suit the prologue. It'll simply make more sense after the narrative that you've just read. For one thing, I won't involve myself in that absurd, antiquated Atari versus Commodore squabble, or whatever versus whatever. It's a bit pathetic at this point, don't you think? The cool piece of plastic and silicone that my daddy got me in the 80s is better than the cool piece of plastic and silicone that your daddy got you. I've always gone with the games, myself, rather than the hardware companies. Some games are better on the Commodore 64, while others are superior on the Atari computers, the 8-bits. 400, 800, all those great computers. A few of my favorite C64 games aren't even available for the Ataris, and vice versa. Everyone has his own tastes. After all, there's no good or bad except subjectively, just as there's no real difference at all between art and entertainment. Either something gives you pleasure or it doesn't. To make yourself so impressionable that you'll allow mere sociological imposition into your day-to-day enjoyments and gratifications and aesthetics when it comes to music, for instance, and therefore, cumulatively, the quality of your life is definitely to disserve yourself. Whether or not the item in question is made available commercially is incidental to my admittedly sweeping definition of entertainment. But it certainly goes without saying that the mythical, fictional, high versus low art distinction represents lingering class envy at its most infantile. But I could go on. Clearly, my point, if you'll cast your mind back, is that somebody else can't possibly tell you what your tastes are. That's why so-called critics are useless. Always have been, always will be. With regard to any art form, video games included, no matter how good the writer, you cannot be convinced, for instance, to hate a food that's one of your favorites, or form a sudden fondness for something that makes you gag. One's true tastes in games, music, etc. are just as personal. All of the 8-bit computers and consoles of the 70s and 80s have their complementary strengths and weaknesses. That's what's great about having all of them at hand, again thanks to emulators. So what, I would ask a contender, is the argument really about? I'm genuinely curious about the motive. What do you hope's going to occur if you actually persuade somebody to say, okay, you're right, your favorite old computer is niftier than mine. Do you win a prize? What do you get, the Lost Sword Quest treasures? Brand loyalty is purposeless. Decades-old brand loyalty betrays some kind of psychosis. Yet, even as I type that, I remain fascinated with the general topic with which I was initially smitten as a kid. If there's a lesson there somewhere, I can be guaranteed to steer well clear of it. Anyway, that kind of bickering doesn't help anyone to learn a thing. Isn't it enough that we have this enthusiasm for old games in common? And that there are so many thousands of them? Isn't it sufficient that we've lived to see a time when we can all finally meet up, regardless of planetary location, to discuss the games and share tips and let each other know about so many with which we're not all acquainted? Before I leave the topic of subjectivity behind, I do not wish to impel you to think like I do. None of the upcoming chapters are reviews. I don't do reviews. One man's 10 is another man's 1. I've only selected games that are among my absolute favorites, and about which I think I have original things to say. The exceptions are games that are gloriously, uproariously bad. When it comes to, let's say, apparently crude or rushed, unfamiliar games, I always try to find the fun, or at least the funny. Lastly, I might as well mention my first favorite video game. The one I would have called my favorite after I'd played a few. Warren Robinette, in terms of game design and programming, was a visionary. He breached a barrier that most other programmers, and most players, I'd imagine, had not even perceived for the breaching. you could now move off of the entire television. Right, move your character off the whole screen, thereby changing your environment, so you could explore for a long time, find stuff. He implemented this when he wrote the VCS game Adventure, of course, consequently constructing the room-changing or scene-switching display kernel. These days we might call it an engine, but it was never called that, it's a kernel. And this was also used in John Dunn's phenomenal Superman game on the Atari, which was started later, obviously, but released first. Alright, the games are separated by chapter. Some that don't have their own chapters are mentioned among those that do, mainly for illustrative purposes. As you know, video games are particularly cross-referential. Up first, Defender, because I go alphabetically. I'll talk about the sequel as well, Stargate.